Yes. Great. Well, good morning and welcome back to Climate Day. Welcome to this first panel, which will focus on scaling up international climate finance. My name is Igor Shishlov, and as they say in France, I wear two different hats. My first hat is here with HEC Paris, where I teach courses on climate change economics and policy. And I'm also running the Climate and Business Certificate together with Daniel. And as you know, the Climate Day is the culmination of the Climate Certificate. My second hat is with Perspectives Climate Group, a German consultancy, where I lead a small team working specifically on climate finance topics. Now, the world of finance, and by extension climate finance, has historically been dominated by men. But as you may have noticed, this is something that's changing. And I'm particularly proud to introduce this panel composed of accomplished women, leaders, who are pushing for positive change and working on climate finance. And I will introduce the panel without further ado in alphabetical order. So I'll start with Pascale Albert-Lebrun, who is the Deputy CEO of Eranove Group, a company that develops essential life services infrastructure, including energy and water access. Pascale is an alumna of HEC Paris and brings in a wealth of experience in infrastructure investments and project finance in developing countries, particularly in Africa. Next, we have with us Joumana Asso, who is the founder and managing director of Clima Capital Partners, a boutique climate finance consultancy. Before founding Clima, Joumana worked for many years in international financial institutions like the International Finance Corporation, the World Bank, and also the Green Climate Fund. Now, third, we have with us Eschalier, who is the senior project manager for climate finance at the Institute for Climate Economics, which is a Paris-based think tank. Claire leads the work of I4C on the alignment of financial institutions with the Paris Agreement. And before I4C, Claire spent several years at Nodalis, a climate and development consultancy, and also worked for Deloitte and the French Development Agency. And that brings me to our final speaker, Stéphanie Mouen, who is the Deputy Director of the Climate and Nature Division at the French Development Agency, AFD. Stéphanie was also the country director of AFD in Tanzania and has experience in other African countries such as Senegal. And before joining AFD, Stéphanie worked for Société Générale, so she has also private sector experience. Now, I very much look forward to this stimulating discussion because our panelists really represent different types of institutions and will be able to bring in different angles to this debate. So to start off, we're going to have initial statements from each of the panelists, followed by a few questions to kickstart our discussion, and then of course we'll have enough time to take some questions from the audience. Now I would like to start with Claire, who is going to provide us a quick overview of climate finance negotiations, the distinction between Paris alignment and climate finance, and maybe also some thoughts on the international finance architecture. So Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much, Igor, for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation also. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. So yeah, I was asked to kind of set the scene a little bit for today's panel. In fact, a lot has been said during the keynote earlier, so I'm going to try not to repeat too much what was said, but it's, oops, that's the wrong way. But yeah, essentially I wanted maybe to start off because earlier on during the keynote, and it was very clearly established and very true that there was a before and an after Paris, the Paris Agreement, which took place in 2015. But in fact, climate discussions have been going on for several years already, several tens of years already, and back in the 20th century, we were already talking about climate finance to a certain extent. So I just wanted to maybe come back to a few of the milestones in international discussions before the Paris Agreement, before moving to what the Paris Agreement changed and why it was a game changer for a lot of international actors. So looking back, one of the first milestones was in 1992 with the Rio Convention, which set the scene for all the international discussions that are still taking place now, particularly with the adoption of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which is still the framework and the context under which a lot of the international discussions on climate are going on today. Then 5 years later in Kyoto in 1997, which was COP3, I think, the Kyoto Protocol was the first treaty to set or to speak about emission reductions and to set legally binding objectives on that. They were not that ambitious, and they only concerned a number of countries, developed countries at the time, but still that was a very important milestone as well at the time. Then Copenhagen was when the first temperature goal was set. It was 2 degrees temperature, an increase in 2 degrees maximum by the end of the century. And with also the first target in terms of helping developing countries finance their transition with the $100 billion that developed economies were supposed to provide to developing economies to support them with financing the transition. Then in 2011, the Durban conference was more of an implementation conference, but it was an important one because that's when the Green Climate Fund was set up, and among other implementation instruments. And then in 2015, the Paris Agreement, which, as was extensively said earlier, was a game changer because not only did it was it legally binding, did it concern all the economies, both developed and developing. It also set 3 very important objectives, formally, and setting them into stone in the Paris Agreement, which we're still discussing extensively today. The first one was having a more ambitious temperature goal, so moving from 2 degrees to trying to be even more ambitious to limit the temperature increase by the end of the century to 1.5 degrees. Then it was also about bringing back adaptation into the discussion, which, as was said earlier, also is a very, very important topic, too often left out still today. And so the second main objective of the Paris Agreement was about strengthening the adaptation capacity, particularly in developing countries, and helping them build resilient economies. And then the third one, in which I'm going to probably be talking a little bit more extensively about today, is about making financial flows compatible with low greenhouse gas emissions. With a low greenhouse gas and resilient pathway. So it's the first time we talked. That's quite a long way of calling what we say today is about Paris alignment, meaning we try to align the entire financial flows, the entire system, with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, and not only looking at the climate investments, which was more related to the 100 billion goal that was set in Copenhagen. So that's a very, very important game changer, because it means that we're not just looking at the finance that goes towards climate investments, but we're also looking at what's happening in the rest of the economy and the rest of the financial flows. So it's the first time you distinguish, or at least kind of officially, between the first official distinction between climate finance, which is more related to international diplomacy discussions, and it tracks the finance that goes towards developing economies and local, so from developing to developing and from developed to developing economies, but it doesn't take into account the flows that go to the north. And these flows also need to be new and additional, which is what climate finance is about. Whereas Paris alignment finance or aligned finance is about what's going on in the rest of the economy and in the entire economy. So that's particularly important, and it's a big milestone it was a big milestone of Paris alignment discussions. With that, I think I just wanted to maybe focus on why Paris alignment is so important, because, as you know, it was said earlier that we're not on track to reach the agreements that were set in the Paris objectives and the temperature goals that we've set ourselves. This is a graph, an illustration that comes from our colleagues from the Climate Policy Institute, which I think is quite striking. The figure at the bottom, the line at the bottom, the green one, is the climate finance that goes through the entire economy. So we're not even focusing on the diplomatic climate finance here, which is the 100 billion objective. We're talking about the global economy, also including north-north flows. So as you can see, the amount of climate finance that's flowing in the entire economy is about to reach or reaching $1.3 trillion. But it's still nothing compared to what the investment needs are in the global economy, somewhere between 11 or between 5 and 11 trillion, rather. So you can see there's a big gap in terms of the financing need versus the supply and demand, as someone said earlier, the financing needs and what's actually provided to the economy. And that's not even taking into account the 100 billion, which would be of financial flows to go to the developing economies, which is even a very much smaller part of that. So that's particularly striking there. And as you can see, it justifies why Paris alignment is so important, because we need to be looking at what's going on in the entire economy and also looking at making sure that what we're doing in terms of investments that are not climate investments don't go against the objectives that we've set ourselves. This is a short illustration again from CPI, just to show you where the funding is going to, the finance is going to, and it's what I think is important here is the fact that mitigation is getting a lot of the financing flows today. Adaptation is only a very minor share of the flows that are out there. And also a lot of the funds that are channeled in the economy today are in the form of loans, which is particularly important when you're talking about developing economies, because it means we're increasing their debt burden and potentially not solving their problems that well, because it's only pushing the problem back to later, and it's increasing their distress the distress of their economies in other ways. So that's also a big issue here. As you can see, so there's public and private finance here. But these 1.3 trillion US dollars that channeled every year only represent 2% of the global GDP today. So there is money out there. The question is more how you mobilize it and how you make sure that it's going in the right direction and to the right types of projects. I just wanted to focus, this is an extract for some of the work that we've been doing over the past few years on Paris alignment, just to illustrate more what Paris alignment is about. So as you can see in what we call the bullseye to the left-hand side, there's 3 levels of Paris alignment. The first one is making sure that everything that you do doesn't go against the objectives that have been set out. And these objectives need to be set out at national level and be country-owned, and that's where the Paris Agreement asks from each country to define its own trajectory to be ambitious enough. So we need to make sure that every investment that's made in these economies doesn't go against these objectives that are set out. The second level is to make sure that some of the investments that we make do support the climate investments. So yeah, making sure that this is more related to climate finance, but making sure that some of these investments go towards climate projects. And then the last one, and this is probably where public development banks, particularly there's a big ask for public development banks, is to foster transformative outcomes. Essentially, it's about making sure that some of the investments that you're making contributes to the broader shift of the global economy. So for instance, through making sure that the business environment is changed. We were talking earlier on about making the business environment conducive for the private sector. It's also about supporting some major actors in the economy, such as energy utilities, for instance, making sure that they can also transform to take on the changes that are expected from them. And that's something that's where we see public finance as being particularly critical for these types of investments. On the right-hand side, you can see that climate finance and aligned finance do overlap quite a bit, but are not necessarily exactly the same. So you'll have some aligned finance, which isn't necessarily climate finance. For instance, some social types of investments or investments that are made during a crisis to support pandemics, for instance. And on the other hand, you can also have, and that's probably less intuitive, but you can also have some climate finance which isn't necessarily aligned. And that's when, for instance, you're investing in a project which is going to have some short-term climate co-benefits, but it isn't aligned with the long-term pathway or the long-term strategy that the country has set out. So, for instance, if you're building a hydropower project and you don't take into account the fact that in 20 years' time there won't be enough water, well, then the project would be considered to be misaligned, despite being potentially classified as climate finance. And I just wanted to, I'm not sure where I am with time, but I just wanted to maybe start with my final slide is on the next steps and the discussions that are going on at the moment, which are quite structuring, I think, for the coming years. Over the past 2 years, since 2021, there's been a call for a reform of the global financial architecture, so which has come from different angles. And I've just put 3 up there, but there's even more than that. The first one, the Bridgetown Initiative. Bridgetown is the capital of Barbados. So it was the Prime Minister of Barbados who in 2021, I think, called the international community to analyze and to look more into how developing countries can address their liquidity risks and the fact that they don't necessarily have the money to address the short-term and all the even existing impacts of climate change, and even more so to address the long-term effects and to transform as they should be. So there's a big work stream at the moment that's tackling how to support these developing the more vulnerable countries with these issues of debt distress, and to help them with through different innovative financial mechanisms with that. The second one was more G20, issued by the G20 in 2020. I think it was also 2021 under the Italian presidency, who called for multilateral development banks who are providing a lot of the funding to international climate finance, at least in a diplomatic way of thinking, to increase their lending headroom and to think about how they can review their operating model and their procedures to better use the money and the capital that they have, and to be more effective, essentially, in the way they're doing things. So there were a number of recommendations that came out of this CAF review and that are also being implemented or starting to be implemented today, ahead of which the World Bank. And the World Bank was also called for by its shareholders, and I think it was G7+3 shareholders, who asked the World Bank and the broader MDB system to look into how it could reform more generally, yes, its procedures and be more fit for purpose to address the big gap that we saw a minute ago. And with that, the World Bank came up with up until last year, the World Bank didn't have climate in its mandate, and now it has included a livable planet as being part of its objectives. So yeah, the idea is to make the MDBs and the world, ahead of which the World Bank and the broader international financial system, more fit for purpose. So I think these are 3 key discussions, and and yeah, we're looking forward to the ones coming up as well with the COP29. I think there'll be a question on that a bit later on, maybe. Looking forward.
Thank you very much, Claire, for this comprehensive overview. I think it sets the scene nicely for the rest of our discussion. You showed the famous spaghetti chart from CPI. I'm glad we have a big screen so that you could actually see what's in there. It shows us, one of the things it shows us is also the importance of public finance in mobilizing international climate finance flows. So with that, I wanted to pass the floor to Stéphanie. Maybe you can say a few words about what public finance institutions' role is in mobilizing climate finance, and perhaps the topic of Paris alignment also resonates with what you do at AFD.
Thank you, Igor. Thank you for the invitation, and really happy to be here with you today. So I will, yes, perhaps give a few insights about what role bilateral banks can play in scaling up climate finance. So first, a few words about AFD, Agence Française de Développement. I don't know if all of you are aware of our activities. So AFD is a bilateral development finance institution in charge of French official development aid. We are intervening in 115 countries, low and middle income countries, and also overseas territories. And we are providing grants or loans at favorable rates, what we call concessional loans, to local actors such as ministries, local authorities, banks, NGOs, or even businesses through our private sector arm, which is called Proparco. So since 2005, climate has been a priority for AFD because, of course, climate and development are two interrelated emergencies. So what role can we play? Ibrahim Adjang reminded us earlier of the years before the Paris Agreement, and Claire also, you reminded us of all the steps before the Paris Agreement. On our side, our climate strategy has evolved from first carbon footprint measuring, starting in 2007, to the ambitious target of dedicating 50% of our financings to projects with climate co-benefits. So this means projects having a direct and beneficial impact on the climate. Our methodologies for tracking climate finance for mitigation but also adaptation are based on common principles agreed by the multilateral development banks and also the IDFC members. IDFC is an international development finance club of around 27 national and international public development banks. And so our climate financing has more than doubled between 2015 and 2023, from 3 billion euro to 7.5 billion euro last year, thanks to the inclusion of climate consideration in all our portfolio and all our projects. We have also ramped up our efforts to facilitate climate adaptation. We have seen on the graph that this is really the small part of climate finance, allocating 3 billion in 2022, representing 40% of climate finance for AFD. So this increase in climate financing was made possible by what we call mainstreaming climate in all sectors of activities. So climate mainstreaming is all about systematic integration of climate considerations through a financial institution strategies and operations. So for us, for mitigation, for instance, it started with project in infrastructure, which is the most obvious, such as energy project or project in transportation. But it was also extended to agriculture, financial sector intermediation, and now also social sectors. For climate adaptation, it has been incorporated into projects, particularly in the fields of water, sanitation, rural development, irrigation projects, for instance. But as Claire said, climate finance is not enough. So we had to take care of the 50% other of activity of projects and make sure that they won't have negative impacts on climate. So this is why in 2017, so just 1 year after the ratification of the Paris Agreement, the AFD group undertook to make its activity 100% compatible with the Paris Agreement. So it implies for us analyzing each of the group's intervention to see that they are consistent with the Paris Agreement, that they are consistent with long-term carbon, low carbon and resilient development in the country where they are implemented. So that is very important because this is a country-based analysis. So what does 100% Paris Agreement for us at AFD? So first, it means to make sure that no project is financed or that is financed has or may have a negative impact on climate change. So that was the little circle that Claire showed. That's what we call the do not harm process. So in our institution, it is measured and we make sure that there are no negative impacts through three main tools. So first one is an assessment of the level to which our investments are exposed to climate risks. So be they physical climate risk or related to low carbon transition policies. So we have for that a climate screening tool. we just have for each project at the examination stage sustainable development analysis and opinion system, which ensures that our 100% Paris Agreement objective is met in terms of low carbon transition and resilience. So with a note from -2 to 3 for each project that is financed by AFD. And then we also have an exclusion list for all the activities of the group, so not only related to climate, but for climate, for instance, we have an exclusion of financing fossil fuels for now on. So secondly, alignment with Paris Agreement means for us supporting countries' trajectories to set up ambition, nationally determined contribution, national action plans and long-term strategies, and to bring support to enable climate policy reforms to emerge in the country and be sure that conditions are fulfilled to enable emergence of private finance, for instance, also. So we have evolved to financing climate policy reforms through public policy loans, for instance. So budget support for public policy for us is a crucial tool for supporting development and implementation of public policies targeting low carbon and resilient development trajectories. So they are usually built around 3 components. First, there is a public policy dialogue backed by the matrix of indicators related to climate reforms. Then there is a budget support through loans, which are disbursed based on achieving these climate triggers. And then usually technical cooperation supported through grant funds. We have also developed specific programs such as Adapt Action or what we call the 2050 facility. So the 2050 facility is a grant program supporting around 30 countries, 30 developing countries, in the development and implementation of their long-term strategies in low carbon and resilient development and public policies. So for instance, the 2050 facility supported Colombia in developing its climate strategy and submitting it to the UNFCCC in 2021. It also financed a macroeconomic modeling project, which has already been utilized to measure socio-economic impacts of climate change in Vietnam. So just a few examples. We have also a program dedicated to adaptation, which is called Adapt Action, focusing on countries in Africa and Mediterranean countries, and structure around the triptych understanding, planning, and investing approach to strengthen the resilience of the vulnerable population and ecosystems in these countries. So this is what we call alignment of flows with and supporting the country's public policies. Thirdly, alignment of flows for us also means ambition to mobilize the entire financial system. So AFD Group has stepped up its efforts both to mobilize the financial system, the financial sector through loans directly to banks, for example, specific green credit lines, for instance, and also loans or support to insurance company. We had examples of financing, for instance, to the ARC this morning. We are also supporting the private sector through direct financing by Proparco, be it via loans, guarantees, or equity products to companies or private banks, and also support to the greening of financial systems via strategic dialogue with new players such as central banks, for instance. So catalyzing finance means also for us working hand in hand with the multilateral development banks, Also other bilateral development banks joining forces, and also receiving funds from other institutions such as the European Union, the Green Climate Funds, to which we were accredited in 2015. And also one other point I wanted to mention, in order to have a catalytic effect on climate finance and public policy reforms, we also see great advantages in country platform approaches, which have been set up since about 2 years, whereby a coalition of actors, a coalition of countries, support the full spectrum of issues in the countries, from robust long-term strategies, nationally determined contribution, national adaptation plans, to the establishments of enabling policies, planning capacities, investment plans. So the first country platform of this kind focused on mitigation in the energy sector. This is what we call the JETP, so Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which were announced by the G7 during the COP26. And this JETP aimed to help emerging countries decarbonize in a fair manner. So typically, they include a dialogue to move away from fossil fuel dependency through early closure of fossil fuel plants, for instance, pipe reduction or investments in renewable energies. For instance, France and AFD are active in several JETP that were set up, so mainly in South Africa, but also there are also discussions in Vietnam. There has also been a case for Pact for Adaptation in Bangladesh this year, so discussions around this dialogue between countries and the government on adaptation also, which is quite new. And I also want to mention, but this is not the topic of today, that there are some similar initiatives related to nature and biodiversity with what we call positive conservation partnerships developed in some countries, mainly in Africa, DRC and Congo, for instance. So lastly, what I want to say also is not to forget about everything that is not financial. So we mentioned the importance of public policy dialogue, but I also want to mention that development banks have a major role to play to reorient global public and private investment towards investments adapted to countries' low carbon and resilient transitions. We are actively promoting this goal in the IDFC and finance in common networks and coalitions, which account for 15% of global climate investment and can have a snowball effect for the remaining 85% of financial flows. So IDFT, as I mentioned earlier, is a unique global network of 27 national, regional, and international development banks, 19 of which are based in developing countries. And this network has, since its inception, been co-chaired by AFD, and this last year it is co-chaired by the West African Development Bank and by Bancoldes, so the national bank in Colombia. So we also intend to mobilize more broadly public development banks via the Finance in Common Summit, gathering annually around 500 public development banks since the first summit organized in November 2020. So we promote in these coalitions exchange of best practices on topics such as alignment with the Paris Agreement, on topics such as convergence also of climate and biodiversity finance, and also, for instance, about financial risks related to climate and biodiversity. And finally, we are working with our partners to influence and collaborate on the convergence of norms, practices, and standards to develop an aligned framework for sustainable finance. So, for instance, we cooperated with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD, which was created by the G20 in 2016, and which aims to improve corporate climate financial transparency. So these were just a few examples of the role of a bilateral DFI such as AFD can play in international climate finance, and also about aligning what it means for us when we talk about aligning financial flows with the Paris Agreement. So thank you very much, and I remain available for any question. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stéphanie. It seems like you have a lot of work to do at AFD. You touched upon many important topics, which I hope some of them we can unpack during the Q&A session. I think you highlighted very nicely that it's not only about finance, it's about many things that enable financial flows. You talked about supporting policy reform processes, just energy transition partnerships, JETP. I actually happen to work on JETP in Vietnam, supporting the EU delegation there. And I must say that it's a tough nut to crack. It's not only about enabling finance, it's also about reforming the energy markets, looking at what happens with the utility monopoly, etc., etc. You touched also upon, I think, long-term strategies and country NDCs, and I think that makes a nice segue to our next speaker, Joumana. I know that you've done a study on financial needs for the implementation of NDCs around the world. Would you like to say a few words about this study and the implications for different actors of NDC financing?
Yes, thank you. Should I present Clima for 2 minutes? Just stay on suspense and I'll get to the answer. Is it working? Okay. So we are a climate finance advisory firm. We are based in Washington, D.C., but we love Paris, so we come often. Our portfolio is mostly in Africa, and I do regret that I missed the presentation of Ibrahim Sheikh Diong. I think I'll meet him in Paris. We do intervene in a very strategic but very pragmatic way, because many of us have worked at the World Bank, the IFC, international financial institutions. So we do understand very well the landscape, what are the prohibiting factors, but we have also experience on the ground. Most of us also come from very much of investment background. So we did structured finance, project finance, corporate finance, private equity. We were pioneers in private equity in 2005 in the clean tech sector. We do intervene also on national level by designing investment plans for the implementation of the Paris Agreement for countries. So many countries issued this commitment, and they call it the NDC document, the nationally determined contributions, but they had no way how to implement those targets. Some of these NDC documents came with a pipeline of projects for mitigation and adaptation, but many of them were constructed in very thematic way, saying, yeah, we will reduce X amount of CO2 for mitigation in 3 sectors, transport, energy, and industry, but there were no support with a concrete pipeline of projects. What are the projects on the national level? So we do construct also national climate finance strategies. The goodwill about climate finance is that we have really to act. We have no other option. We are all being affected, and we have to do something here. In that sense, we do also work a lot on taxonomies, and you referred, Stéphanie, to the AFD. So there have been a first initiative by joint MDB work with the AFD and the IDFC, the International Development Finance Club, to constitute a taxonomy. And a taxonomy is a bit of a standard. It's standards where we can qualify something as climate finance or not. Is it mitigation? Is it adaptation? And this came to counter the greenwashing, which was happening at a high level, particularly from China. So we do interfere, we do design taxonomies on national level. We work a lot on green bonds. We structured a little bit than $500 million of credit line facilities for the AFD. for green funding, green financing in financial institutions across Africa, Asia, and so on. So de facto, we are very pragmatic, and then I'll be very pragmatic in this presentation. The question is, how do we scale up? This is the title of this panel, isn't it? So now I want to connect a little bit with what was presented about the spaghetti chart, which I really hate the name. I don't know what they call it. It makes it a little bit banal. So we did in 2021 a study with Aviva investors. We took the Paris Agreement document for 126 developing countries to have an assessment how much climate finance we need between the time we undertook the study and 2030, which is the cut deadline for the NDC documents. This was the outcome. So we thought for 126 countries there will be 7.8 trillion needs between the time and 2030. The breakdown is, as you see, about 6 trillion in mitigation, 2 trillion for adaptation. A cross-cutting is nominal. And when we analyzed very carefully, document by document, we do realize adaptation was underestimated by most of the NDC documents across the world, because mitigation is very easy to define. There are mostly viable projects, easy to formulate. It's related to CO2 reductions. How do you define adaptation? Adaptation is very soft in certain way. The indicators are much more complex, and I would like to counter to what my colleagues said, all these international ideological debates. Is it social? Is it not social? Climate finance, in certain way, is social, because adaptation indicators are social and health. So de facto, it is social, and it takes into consideration other factors. Maybe it doesn't take into consideration biodiversity, but it looks at forests and so on. So let's avoid the dogmatic debates and get to the bottom line of this discussion. So we think 7.8 is underestimated. If we take a very conservative approach and say adaptation should need the same as mitigation, we get to a number of 13 trillion, the need between now and 2030 for developing countries. So just to give you a bit the idea also about the regional distribution, indeed, South Asia dominates alongside Sub-Saharan Africa. South Asia, because as you know, if you look carefully about the countries, it's mostly in mitigation, because these are very developed countries. They are on high industrial path, and also we are talking about large economies. India, yeah, it's equivalent to all Africa. Then Africa, we know the needs, mitigation and adaptation and so on. And then it's followed by other countries, as you see, Middle East and North Africa, very little. And when we examined their portion of adaptation, we were quite puzzled, very small adaptation, although we know that Middle East and Africa, North Africa, they have a big issue of water scarcity, agriculture and so on. So that is an indication that there were underestimates of adaptation needs and climate resilience, plus all the coastal areas, exposure to climate change, the need for infrastructure and so on. Of course, we looked at Latin America, and then you have Europe and Central Asia. We should have put the slide with percentages, but the chart on the right side can show you the lion's share. Africa needs help. I would say it's an emergency situation. So we need about 13 to 14 trillion between now and 2030. How much is being mobilized for climate finance globally? 650 billion per year, and this bundles developing and developed countries. To our knowledge, it's less than 100 billion per year, and that's why the debate in the COP, the first commitment have never been achieved. from Copenhagen that we will put 100 billion for developing countries, and that's why the fight in every COP between developing and developed. So, to my knowledge, as you know, my colleague here, Claire, referred to the Green Climate Fund. It was set up in we said we set it up in 2009. It started operation in 2013. We are 10 years later. How much they mobilized of funding? 13 billion. What is 13 billion? So we worked on an investment plan for Guinea, and their NDC Paris Agreement document is about 17 billion. So the whole hurrah, the whole theater, the poetry, the policies, all the documents we're writing, it's not sufficient. It's a drop in the ocean of the needs. So what do? Let's be positive, nevertheless, and try to find solutions. So from our experience on the ground, and we are very much talking to the banks and to the private sector, we think that we should enable the financial sector in developing countries so they start to channel and up their game, because this is the most efficient way to have finance mobilized at scale, number one. Number two, it's a way to introduce climate finance within the national level, so we are not reliant on donor funding all the time, because the developed world has its own issues and going through its own economic crisis. So it makes perfect sense to declare independence and start to rely on one's own sources. However, to do that, and the approach of the AFD and other institutions is very valid. So to enable the financial institutions, there are two levels of work which is being done. Igor will tell me when I am close to 8 minutes. Almost, okay. It's very interesting. So I'm just, pulling your legs. How do we think it's important to enable the financial sector in the countries and financial institutions? There are two levels. One is we need absolutely to integrate ESG and climate risk measuring and reporting within the operations of these banks, the investment and the portfolio, the investment cycle and the portfolio management. We need to start reporting and measuring and become accountable, so we can talk also how much we reduce CO2, what is the level of our exposure to climate risk, and so on. So this is one level. So we have been working a lot with the AFD, for example, on integrating, doing work with financial institutions on this level, but this comes with also providing climate finance, provide capital to invest in climate projects, because most of the time the liquidity and appropriate financial terms are absent in many of the developing countries. So either tenors of funding are short, it's perceived as high-risk sectors, so they are priced very expensive compared to conventional sectors, hotel or textile or something like that. And then also there are questions of liquidity in some of the countries. So that takes me to the other point. So that we need, it's the blended finance, because blended finance is needed really to structure viable vehicles to reduce risks on one hand, de-risk investments, but also it can be used as a leverage. In that sense, the climate finance international sources available globally, they need to be used in an intelligent way and structured in an intelligent way, so they can create leverage and used very carefully within specific instruments. Now, assuming we have the blended finance structures, we need financial viability attached to the pipeline of projects. And this is, takes me to the other point that Claire talked about. So we blame the MDBs about not investing enough, mobilizing funding enough. Well, number one, there isn't enough viable pipeline of projects. You cannot invest in projects that are not viable. The money is wasted. So we need to work on creating those pipelines. Otherwise, these credible institutions indeed lose their credit rating. But also, remember, the World Bank was set up within the Bretton Woods historic situation. And there are some financial policies set at the time, including capital adequacy, for example. So we cannot lend much more beyond what we have. But who are the shareholders? It's the developed world club. It's all our, it's the European and North American country. So to ensure that we can invest more, they have to put more money. So this is a very complicated issue, and it's very technical. Of course, it's being used politically to reform the MDBs, but it is, I would put some question marks on that. So last point, looking at the pipeline of projects, we have to be very careful. All assets are not equal. Some of the pipeline of projects from developing countries can be financed by private sources. Others are completely public sector material, and others could be PPPs. The blended finance has to look very carefully at that. We cannot go to private investors and tell them invest in projects that are high risk. We have to look at the risk profile of projects one by one, but also there is the macro risks. Some countries have governance issues. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joumana. I think you raised several important points, and I liked how you boldly put it in terms of the numbers, the financing needs, and how it's orders of magnitude higher than what we are trying to negotiate in terms of international public finance at the COP, at COP29. So I think that makes a nice segue. It is clear that international public finance is not going to suffice. We really need private sector engagement. And luckily, on our panel, we have with us Pascale. So Pascale, would you tell us a little bit about what are the challenges you are facing in terms of scaling up your investments? Joumana mentioned questions about risk, risk perception, maturity. I'm sure you have a lot to tell us about it.
Sure. Thank you, Igor. If you just enter the first line on the screen, please. Okay. Just in this slide, you have a few topics regarding Eranove Group. I will not comment everything. Just to tell you that Eranove is an industrial group. It is a private group, headquartered in Paris, but acting exclusively in Africa. Our core activities are first management of public services, distribution of electricity, distribution of drinking water to population, and also production of this energy and this drinking water. So we say that our mission is to provide access to services essential to life at affordable cost for all the population. Affordable is a very important word. By doing so, we are contributing to economic and social development in many countries, and we are contributing to the UN Development Goals number 6, which is clean water and sanitation, and number 7, which is affordable and clean energy. So many more interesting, is how we are doing business, because it is very specific. First, we are doing business with Africa. I mean, our employees are quite all African people. Our managers are African people. Our leaders are African people. No expatriates. Our equity is partly African. And we are developing education, we have an academy, so we are developing more than our core businesses. We are very demanding in the way we are doing business in Africa. That's why, as you can see, we are very fond of ISO certifications. So quality, environment management, anti-bribery, social responsibility, health and safety, energy management. Our objective is that all our African subsidiaries can be certified in the medium term. And for us, it's a very important goal. So as you can imagine, we face a lot of different challenges. So back to financing. The financing changing is one of the main challenges we face. We have a full team of experts in structured finance, and of course they are struggling every day to transform projects into reality. This is very difficult. So what we need as a private group when we develop projects, we have long-term equity. We have shareholders who trust our way to doing business, so we have long-term equity. What we need is long-term loans, long-term debt. And so we need long-term financing. When we build a plant to produce energy or water, the longer the loan, the cheaper the production price. And for African countries, this is very important to have energy or water at a low price. So, of course, we work with development banks like IFC, African Development Bank, and others. They can offer long-term loans in these emerging countries. So we need also an attractive cost of financing, and they can offer that as well. So when I prepare this intervention, I'm just looking for examples to give you about what we did in terms of financing. So I will give you to illustrate three examples to demonstrate that we need finance, long-term maturity, we need interest rates which are attractive, but we need also innovation and agility in the way we are looking for finance. First example is a project we have in Togo. We have to design a financing for a energy production plant, and we had to do that in the local currency, the franc CFA, which can be challenging when you need a long-term loan. So the banks we were discussing with were able to propose 7 years of maturity, not more. And we needed at least 14 years. So what we did, we looked at the market and we found a solution proposed by Guarenco, you maybe know. And Guarenco, we looked a lot with Guarenco, and they put in place what we call a liquidity extension guarantee, which can guarantee that your 7 years loan will be renewed in another 7 years loan. So at the end of the day, you have your 14 maturity you needed at the first place. And it was the first time that Guarenco proposed such an instrument in Africa. Second example is quite different. It is in Côte d'Ivoire, in Ivory Coast. On behalf of the authorities, our electricity distribution company has put in place a very specific and special program to accelerate the access to electricity to the population, especially to the population with low income. The development institutions have provided grants for this program to the Ivorian state. And as a private company, we have pre-financed the connection of new customers. Because when you have a low-income population, the difficulty for people is just to pay the connection price. They can't afford that. It's too high a price for them to pay. So when you pre-finance this price and you allow this new customer to repay this price during a 10 years period, what we did, then you allow a lot of different people to have new access to energy. And this program was a great success. In Ivory Coast, we are able to connect every year 300,000 or 400,000 new customers, new homes, which means with one connection you have 5 people connected. And so you have an acceleration of connection of all the country. That's why the Ivory Coast now is aiming to have 100% of connection within the 6 coming years. Last example is what you have on the screen. It's something which we put in place at Eranove in our headquarters. We used to have a classic corporate revolving credit facility. It's just a credit facility with a French bank, very classical. And we have transformed this into a sustainability green loan. How we did that? With a bank, we negotiated different type of criteria, of goals we have to achieve in 2028. If we achieve these goals, we will have a lower interest rate for this facility. And if we don't, we will pay a higher rate. So these goals are, for instance, the number of population with access to electricity. You can say this is not a Eranove goal, this is a public subject, the population with access to electricity. But we have put this criteria in our own corporate policy. Same for water, population with access to water. And what is quite special is the electricity KPI, which is gas emission per capita, not in value terms, but per capita, because for us in emerging countries, especially in Africa, it is the right way to look at things. So this was the third example. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Pascale. We can come back to your third example during the Q&A session. All right, well, thank you all. This was a lot of food for thought, and I was a terrible timekeeper in the past hours, so I think we'll switch gears and take some questions from the audience. I do have some questions prepared, but since we don't have a lot of time left, I really want to ensure we have enough interaction, and I think there are a lot of topics and questions you could jump on. So can we have the mic, the roaming mic? If we don't have questions, then yeah, okay, we have a question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Sulama Passi. My question is for Eranove. I would like to know what's your economic model. How your business is sustainable? Because I think working with low-income household, it's sometimes difficult to have a business that could be sustainable and profitable. How do you manage that?
Well, thank you for your question, because it's a good illustration of how we can do business in Africa. We are a very profitable private group. Our shareholders are very happy. So it is possible. How we do that? We used to say, doing well is doing good. Doing well for us is to do our day-to-day operation in an efficient way, so we minimize the losses. You know, when you speak about water, if you have an efficient network for distributing water, you have less losses, so your distribution rate is better, and so it's transformed immediately into additional EBITDA. So doing good, doing your operations day-to-day good, well, means you will be profitable and you will do good to population. So we have, to give you an example regarding the population with low income, with a program I just mentioned earlier, we have prepaid methods. It means that to consume electricity, people have to prepay their meters. So we have no issue about getting the cash, because they have to prepay what they will consume later. And regarding private customer, we have we get I think it's 98.5% of the invoice we get in cash. So we have no issue regarding the cash, even if emerging country and low-income population. It's because we are just operating things efficiently, so it is possible.
So Pascale, I guess we're in a business school, so the message to students
it
is possible to
possible.
operate profitable business in Africa, working on sustainable development. And I hope it gives also a positive message to our students. All right, thank you. Do we have I think we have a question in the middle. Yes.
Yeah, just one quick question.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Zara. I'm a master's student here at HEC. So I wanted to ask you about the basically potential of projects in Africa, just the different projects that you're currently working on, where the most potential basically lies, because since most of the projects that you're currently investing is in Africa, I was wondering if the market in Europe is very saturated and that's why you moved towards Africa, and where the most potential basically lies there. What specific projects do you think you should currently invest in, and what currently banks are currently, pushing for and really giving loans for? Yeah.
Who wants to take the question? It's quite a broad question. I guess, Pascale, you can say a few words, but then maybe we can hear from others.
Can start, yes. We have, in Africa, of course, we have a lot of projects in our pipeline, mainly for production of energy, which, of course, it's one of the needs Africa has currently, but also for water, which is, we know that we will be a huge issue in the future. And this is the case in a lot of countries in Africa. And so to produce energy, of course, the main issue today is the way you produce energy. We all try to do that in a clean way. It's not always possible because you have an affordable issue. If you produce energy and if it is very expensive to produce, nobody will buy you the energy, or you won't be paid for it. So every project is very complex, because at the end of the day, what is important is the production price. It is the same for water. If you are not able to produce at an affordable price, it will not be useful, because nobody will buy you the energy you produce, and it will be just a loss of energy.
Perhaps I can give a few thoughts also about your question. I think the potential in Africa for private investors is huge, because the needs are huge. So if you take the example of the energy sector, there are still enormous needs in terms of production, generation of electricity, but also in terms of access. So in all, and it's the same for water, but the private sector is perhaps less involved yet in these countries for water, but there are some cases. So, for instance, in a lot of countries now, you have what we call independent power producers who are financing and also building renewable energy. So, such as, of course, hydropower plants, solar plants, etc. So for me, there is a lot of potential, and now there are a lot of investors and private companies from different countries in Africa, and the potential for that is greater than in Europe or developed countries, because there is no need in terms of generation, or really a few needs. And the question is about financing these needs, whereby you can go, of course, to public development banks who are providing, you mentioned earlier the issue of the tenor of loans, of the maturity of loans. So we are providing usually long-term loans from 20 to 20, so that can be an interest for private companies. And there are, of course, also banks in the countries, national banks, providing also financing to the private sector. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think you touched upon a very important point on, risk perception and interest rates that are currently, going up, and of course for investments in renewables compared to investments in traditional fossil fuel generation. They are more sensitive to interest rates and they require high maturity. So it's really about creating financial products that match the sort of the profile of these investments. We had another question here in the third row. Yep.
Hello. Thank you for all your presentation. It's very interesting to me. I'm following a master about sustainable transition at HEC, and I don't know much about the world of global financing, so it's very interesting to understand a bit better. For what I understand, we have very few years to achieve a major change for the decarbonization transition. And I think your point about the financial viability of the projects that are financed is super important, because the way I see it, and maybe I don't know a lot about it, but why we have such a gap between the finance provided and the needs, it's because the returns of investing in all these projects is not high enough compared to other projects that might actually damage the climate. So do you see any hope that the game radically change in the very few coming years? Meaning that the way the returns are calculated better includes the negative externalities of damaging the climate, and maybe integrate more the positive effects of projects that have valuable add-ons for the decarbonization?
That's an excellent question. Thank you very much. What's your name?
Guylaine.
Guylaine. Thank you, Guylaine, for your question. Joumana, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, could I? Thank you. This is a very good question. If I may, so indeed, I mean, the gap between demand and supply is big due to lack of viable projects, but also in some countries, the financial sector doesn't provide adequate financing and diversity of instruments. So many countries, for example, they don't have equity market. There is no equity investment. They have only banks providing loans, and they have a monopoly. Then somebody raised the question of local currency risks. Many of the market we operate in, they don't have a swap market to do the swap to cover those type of risks, currency risks. So this is a different dimension. Then just to be on the positive side, indeed, because of this climate crisis, we are pushed to create more response and mobilize, think more globally also. Because, I mean, we have to work together. So the funds are being mobilized more, but there is more capacity locally, also domestically, in know-how, technical skills. The banking is becoming more sophisticated. Complementarities between instruments is happening also, because as you know, a project is financed by multiple ways. You could put guarantees, you could put to enable loans, then you can have equity. There are so many instruments. So the markets are becoming more sophisticated in developing countries, and in that sense, we are going on a more positive trajectory, I would say. But very good question, thank you. I mean, this is, I should say, it's business. These are the questions we need to ask, if we can.
Claire?
Thank you, Igor. Thank you. Just maybe to add another perspective, because we've been talking a lot about financial instruments and so the kind of the supply of finance. There's also another aspect which we haven't touched too much upon today, but I think is also very important, is how the environment can change. And there's a lot going on at the moment at the European level on financial regulation, what should be required from financial institutions on how they can integrate climate risks into their transition plans. What's expected from central banks, with different coalitions that are being set up that have been set up and are being progressively implementing work plans on these topics. So central banks, regulators, financial institutions from the public and the private side, they're all working on how to better integrate these considerations into their activities. And so I think by changing the environment and also maybe things like contractual legal environments and governance, things like that, that can also make significant change and can be, can shift the way the economy is and the way investments are seen in quite a dramatic and short-term way. And also there's the issue which we haven't probably touched much upon, is about public policies that are subsidizing and supporting projects that do harm to the economy, and there's a lot of money also that can probably shift, and that's probably more linked to financial instruments and blended finance, but that can be shifted from these projects towards supporting more transformational projects.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I think you touched upon an important topic, the flip side of mobilizing climate finance. There is also what we sometimes call negative climate finance, which is essentially subsidies in different forms to investments, continued investments in fossil fuel infrastructure, and these are around the same level as climate finance flows these days. So we're at the same time pressing, the gas and the brake pedals of the energy transition, and this is of course very problematic. Maybe just to create a little bit of a debate here, Pascale, when we were talking last week, you mentioned the potential effects of these new regulations that Claire just mentioned for European banks, and how this may have, that may backfire essentially in Africa. Would you like to say a few words about it?
Yes, sure. It is just our, experience and feeling. What we see today is that it is more and more difficult to have financial European partners. French banks, namely, they are disengaging from Africa. They do that because they tell us we can't be compliant now. We are European entities, we have to comply with European regulation, and in many African countries it is not possible for us. So we have no choice but to go away. So for us it's an issue, because these banks are long-term partners. For us, we are a European group, and so to see these European financial partners disappear can create problems, and they are replaced by other financial group, of course. They take the available space. So we think maybe there is something new to invent. We are the first who want to comply with CSRD and everything. Of course, we are working on it. But maybe we have not measured all the side effects of all this new regulation for all the European group who want to implement business in a country like Africa, where they will simply not be able to comply, and so they will not want to do business anymore.
Yeah, thank you, Pascale. I think this is very interesting and shows also the complexity of the transition. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for your insights. My name is Marlene. I'm a student at a Sustainable Transition Management course. I have a very simple question. Do we have 13 billion available globally, or 14 billion? That amount just sounds huge. Do we have it? Where is it? How can we get it? Thank you.
Excellent question. So, Joumana, you talked about this 13 trillion. Would you like to answer?
Yes, so it's trillion, not billion. So I think at this point it's very difficult to have a real credible number of what is available. But if we look at the asset managers globally, they have far beyond that. The question is, how do we invest? Where do we put our money? This is one question. We talk a lot to institutional investors, such as insurance companies, and they tell us, for example, there are a huge amount of, what do they call it, dead assets or something. It's a category of people who got insurance and forgot about it, or they died and nobody claimed dormant investment. So there are a huge amount of that, for example, and it could be estimated in a couple of trillions. So I would imagine there is money. The mining industry should invest in Africa where they are polluting, for example. So we can just pull that number. Sorry, but
yeah, I don't think I have more of a number than you do. Sorry, I didn't look for that. I do think that from my understanding of what research says, the money is out there and available in capital markets, and it all comes back down to Paris alignment again and making sure that this money is used in a way that will go towards financing the pathways of the countries. I think maybe one last thing related to this that we've spoken about NDCs and long-term strategies. I think one of the strong expectations from the private sector is also to have some visibility on where different countries want to go and what's expected from them and how they can get support from the country. So there's an important issue as well related to planning and to planning particularly at the financial level. So it's a bit like having a company, you want to have a business plan as well at country level to be able to tell your shareholders where you're going and what you're planning on doing. I think it's the same at country level. If you want to be able to attract finances, you need to have a strong and credible investment plan. So yeah, that's how to attract money.
Thank you, Claire. Another question from the audience.
So my name is Harshit. I'm a master's student over here. So we talked a lot about the financial instruments such as green bonds or sustainable funds, which are being provided by public or private banks. So how do you think, of course, we talked about changing the investments to green investments from fossil fuels, but we see large US banks right now are also investing a lot in fossil fuels, but also have started these green bonds specifically in Europe also. But how do you think, looking from the other side of it, can these banks maybe incentivize the companies they're already investing into kind of shift towards more renewable activities? Do you think it makes sense to maybe give them some kind of incentive in terms of reward programs or kind of interest rate benefits? Or do you think that is not possible in the current financial scenario?
Stéphanie, would you like to maybe say a few words? I know that at AFD, like you mentioned, for example, green credit lines, and there may be some strings attached when you work with local banks. Maybe this experience could be interesting to share.
Yes, thank you, Igor. Thank you for the questions. Yes, so we are working and trying to work as much as we can with local, national banks to make sure, providing credit lines, so that's what we call intermediation. So providing credit lines to national banks so that they can also provide credit or loans to small or medium enterprise because we cannot finance directly or small K enterprises. We could, but it's not really the best model in order to be able to reach small enterprises. And in order to do that, it needs a lot of, we talked a lot about the system and the sharing of information and trying to convince also about investing in green financing. So what very important aspect is about perception of risk. Because the perception of risk is very important, and also, for instance, when we talk about green technologies, or at least was, about the development of technology. So for now, investing in a solar power plant is not perceived as a high risk, but it's still higher risk than other investments, for instance. And there is a lot also about working on the regulatory environment, because I think you mentioned that, but in a lot of countries, I mean, and it can be the same in France, but in a lot of African countries, for instance, regulatory environment is either not yet set up, so for instance, or there are a lot of changes in regulation that can that have an adverse effect on mobilizing private sector, because usually you invest for 20 years or 25 years in long-term power purchase agreement with the public energy utility. So you need to have a perspective on the risk in the next 20 years, which is not easy, of course. Perhaps we can I can mention also, because you mentioned investment in green financing and also bonds and innovative financial instruments. So I can also just mention that there are a lot of initiatives going on in order to attract private sector capital. There is also a lot going on at the moment about carbon markets. So in order to attract capital for carbon finance, so it can be for energy, transport project, but also for forest. For example, we talk also about blue carbon from ocean. And I think these are also new ways to mobilize finance. So perhaps it's just a little part of the equation, but this is also about a mosaic of solutions and financial tools.
Yeah, thank you, Stéphanie. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so we cannot open the Pandora box of the carbon market discussion and blue economy and other important topics. But during the break, feel free to catch our panelists and ask additional questions. Now, really, we have just a couple of minutes left, and then I know you're all hungry and ready for lunch, which is waiting for us downstairs. Just before that, to wrap it up, I would like to give 1 minute to each of you to give your final message. It can be about your wish list for COP29, or maybe you want to say that COP29 is useless, or anything, any final message that you want to leave our audience with. Starting from you, Joumana. 1 minute.
I'm grumbling now. Okay. In Dubai, there were 70,000 participants. It's impossible. We should reduce the number. It's a very superficial recommendation, because I don't believe we will achieve anything anyway.
Yeah, I said I was going to touch upon what was coming next. I think there's a lot of expectations on the NCQG. That's a bit of a naughty word. The new collective quantified goal. So it's a new 100 billion, which is expected to include everything we talked about today, pretty much. So both talking about volumes, but also impact, making it differentiated and fit for purpose. So I think that's probably the highest expectation that we can have, if not for COP29, for COP20, for the upcoming COPs.
Okay, so on my side, I would say that my wish would also be that adaptation comes back at the forefront of the negotiations, because at the last COP27, it was a little bit behind the scene, I would say. There has been a lot going on, and it's a huge step for the loss and damage fund. So hopefully there will be operationalization of the fund and new commitments to the fund. But really hoping that adaptation comes back. Discussions about adaptation, because for me it's key that countries and governments invest also in projects well adapted, and also through their policies. For instance, in the water sector, it's just very key that all resources are also preserved at territorial levels, and that information is shared also with the most vulnerable population. So, thank you.
So my wish for the next COP would be, I think, to increase the cooperation between the different participants. I strongly believe that if we have to find solution, we will find it together. So private sector, lenders, institutionals, public authorities, I think they all have to work together. They have to understand better the challenges we other face. So, well, I wish them a lot of interesting discussion and mutual understanding.
Thank you. Does it work? No. Yes, it works? Okay. Well, thank you all so much. It was a fascinating discussion. I hope that we left you with a lot of food for thought. And the food for your stomach is waiting for you downstairs. A big round of applause for our panelists.